Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from somewhere in South America for Reason to Resist on January 28th, 2026. Today, we're very pleased to be joined again by friend of Reason to Resist, John Helmer. John is the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Russia and the only Western journalist to direct his own bureau independent of national or commercial ties. Born and educated in Australia, then at Harvard, John has also been a professor of political science, sociology, and journalism, and an advisor to governments, including the hapless governments of Greece and Australia. Thank you very much for joining us again today, John.
Thanks for having me, Dimitri. I'm from somewhere south of you.
That leaves a lot of space. So I'd like to...
we need a lot of space. And one of those other hapless governments you mentioned was the United States of America.
The hapless of the hapless. Yes, indeed. So before we launch into it, John, I just want to remind the members of our audience that if you find this video to be informative, please like and share it. If you're not already a subscriber, we warmly encourage you to become one. We just surpassed 122,000 subscribers after launching this channel about a year and a half ago. And lastly, we have a backup plan in case YouTube one day decides to sabotage us, and that is Rumble, where we post all of our videos. If you're not already a subscriber to our Rumble channel, which is also called Reason to Resist, we hope that you'll become one. So John, I'd like to begin with a question that concerns us all really. Several weeks ago, Russia's government provided to representatives of the Trump regime what it described as definitive proof that Ukraine had attacked a residence of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And you can see up on the screen here one of the articles, many reports relating to that. There's not been too much reporting about the aftermath. Initially, Trump seemed to take the allegation seriously, but then claimed that the CIA had confirmed that the target of the Ukrainian drone attack was not the residence of the Russian president. Since then, John, have you seen concerning indications that powerful voices within the Russian political and military elite want Russia's government to respond more forcefully to this severe provocation by, for example, attacking a NATO country, a NATO military base within a NATO country, or horror of horrors, using a nuclear weapon?
No, nothing like that has come out of the Moscow debate. It's true, as you suggested, that in general, there is an ongoing debate that's semi-public in Moscow over how to respond to attacks of the kind that were directed at the Novgorod residence. Just to be clear, the Russian evidence is that the drone attack was an attack on the Novgorod or Valdai area residence of the president, which also includes a nuclear command control bunker. So that's the, as it were, military facility within which the residence and other buildings and structures and facilities are all located. So saying, as you reported, that the CIA alleged the targeting was a military facility, not the residence, is a deception and misinformation. The combination of the residence and the bunker represent an attack on the president. Now, there's been no confirmation exactly where he was, and there's potentially spurious, potentially truthful speculation that there was an attempt on the American side to fix President Putin's location for a telephone call with President Trump so as to be sure where exactly he was when that attack was underway. I see no evidence to support that particular theory. Nonetheless, there are 2 points to the targeting. First of all, it was a targeting on the president, and therefore requires past tense, requires still a level of retaliation which President Putin has insisted should be measured, essentially tit for tat. And there was an Oreshnik attack, first described as an attack on the European gas storage industry near Lvov, in Lvov area, and then redefined as a target by the Defense Ministry several days later, a very odd gap in the Defense Ministry's information, as a Lvov aviation repair plant. Now, whether underneath that plant there was a command bunker, and whether that bunker included NATO staff officers who are distributed all around the Western Ukraine as well as across the border in Poland, I don't know. And there hasn't been any open source discussion of that targeting, of the delay in confirming the targeting, or whether any further Oreshnik would be appropriate tit-for-tat retaliation. But that's the announced tat for the original tit attack on the location. But we come to a bigger point, and you're right to raise it now for our audience, and that is, what is the end game for the Russian military plans at the moment on the Ukrainian side? Politically speaking, the theory is that by intensifying the electric war, by turning off electricity in vast parts, sections of Kiev, by forcing evacuation of the city, by making Western Ukraine as unlivable as the Ukrainians made Eastern Ukraine unlivable for the Russian-speaking regions between 2014 and 2022. By doing that, the theory is that that the Ukrainian side will be compelled to capitulate on the Russian terms being those which were then tabled again in Abu Dhabi this past week, and which will be, as it were, reopened for discussion in a second round, allegedly or reportedly in Abu Dhabi again, and purportedly on February 1, but those dates and the agenda could slip. So there's an issue. At what point does the Russian side believe there'll be a political capitulation as well as a military one from a combination of retaliatory attacks, tit for tat, and escalation of electric war attacks, and further advances in the ground war? Those are the arguments that let's say, discussions that form the consensus of current General Staff military operating plans. At the same time as we have an attempt by the Kremlin to negotiate US or Trump administration support for a final terms of agreement that would end the war on the Russian terms. And that's involved much more than simply the Ukraine. And that's what we talked about before. That's what happened when Stephen Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and Joshua Gruenbaum went to the Kremlin a week ago. And
could I just pause there for a moment, because I want to take us to those so-called negotiations now. They've resumed, as you pointed out, in Abu Dhabi, the capital of the United Arab Emirates, and we've heard the usual noises about the talks being productive and constructive. Yes. But I myself, I've seen no hard evidence that two sides are materially closer to a deal than they were when Trump returned to the White House 1 year ago. On the contrary, and again, as you point out, Russia is now in the process of de-energizing Ukraine and putting what remains of this country in a worse position, I think, than it's ever been in during this 4-year war. Now, you've just posted an article on your website, Dances with Bears, where you analyze the messages coming out of the Abu Dhabi meetings. And there's the headline, and I just want to quote from your article. You write, "The U.S. side has changed Putin's Anchorage formula by introducing 2 new conditions for resolving the territorial issue. They were tabled at Putin's meeting with Witkoff, Kushner, and Joshua Groenbaum. the Shabbat devotee who has joined the negotiations for Putin's agreement to the U.S. takeover of Gaza through Trump's Board of Peace. The second new Trump demand to add to the Anchorage formula is Putin's acceptance of the U.S. takeover of Greenland, which Yuri Ushakov acknowledged in his readout from the Kremlin meeting, close quote. You then suggest in your article that Russia has made a concession on Greenland. That's the word you used.
Yes.
John, what do you understand Vladimir Putin's position to be with respect to, and of course I'm referring to his government, not just the president, but the Russian government's position with respect to Trump's pursuit of Greenland, and how is the Russian president's position on this issue being received by Russia's political and military elite?
Good question. Let's see if I can start with the statement that President Putin himself made on Greenland. As we talk about, let's call it the big swap. That's the theory of negotiation in which the Trump side is saying, and that's why Grunbaum was there. That's why why I've referred to Grunbaum and Kushner as Chabadists. I mean, they were educated, or in Kushner's case, converted to the Chabad movement, a missionary revivalist movement used to be based in New York, of a Jewish revival. Why are they involved in the swap when the Grunbaum's function has been to negotiate with Israel and to negotiate on the Gaza settlement? Answer: the big swap involves certain concessions that the U.S. side is offering to finalize settlement in the Ukraine war. If Russia steps away from and allows the Trump takeover of Greenland, and if President Putin and Russia join the Board of Peace to accept the U.S. takeover of the future of Gaza through the Board of Peace. So that's the big swap. That's the context in which we're talking. There's the broader negotiation that preceded the Abu Dhabi negotiation focused on the Ukraine. Though Grunbaum was reported to have been in Abu Dhabi, let's just see him as a marker of the big swap, Greenland and Gaza for the Donbass. Let me go to your specific question of what exactly...
Can I just intervene there? Can I just pause for a moment? I just want to clarify one thing you said. You said the Donbass. So do you understand the swap to be limited, the offer of a swap to be limited to the Donbass? Or when you say the Donbass, are you referring to all four of the oblasts plus Crimea? Are you talking about all the territory that Russia has formally annexed?
A fair enough question. And I have to say, I don't know. And outside the negotiating room, it's not clear on the one hand. And we'll just try and get back to Greenland in a minute because it involves Canada too. And the sea war, that's the biggest story. But let's just on the issue of what is the territorial definition that the Russian side would accept. Okay, there's lots of speculation, and there's no point in us adding to theory and speculation. You ask me, what do I know? What exactly are the two sides negotiating? And because they were on the U.S. side, you had General Alexis Grinkiewicz, who's the head of EUCOM, the European command of the United States forces in Europe, and is Supreme Allied Commander in Europe at the table, as well as the U.S. Army Secretary. What's his name? I've suddenly forgotten his name. At the table in Abu Dhabi, you have a military definition of two things. One is the regions that are part of the Russian territory that Ukraine would concede. Is that just the uncaptured or unoccupied, uncontrolled parts of the two Donbas regions, or does it cover the four regions? Donetsk, Lugansk, call that the traditional Donbas, add Kherson and Zaporozhye, making the Novorossiya four regions, all of which are now constitutionally part of the Russian Federation, and of course Crimea. If you take a sort of mean of all of the speculation, it would appear that the Russian side might make a concession to accept less of Zaporozhye and Kherson and all of Lugansk and Donetsk. Okay, so what we might be talking about, but bear in mind, this is purely speculative, and every day the Russian advance takes more territory heading westward. Mm-hmm. That's the, let's call it a border part of the territorial settlement. The second part is the security guarantees part of a settlement, in which the Russian side has said we must have a demilitarized zone between our border, the new border of Russia, and the range in which the Ukrainian side, armed by NATO and the United States, can continue the war against us, Russia, by rocket, by missile, by drone, and by heavier and long-range artillery. So a demilitarized zone moves west of the agreed fixed line. And that's a military question, of course. It also involves enforcement of a DMZ, and that has political implications, because the long-range capabilities of the Ukrainian side to continue the war against Russia would push the DMZ past, going westward, past Kiev. What's demilitarized then about the rump Ukraine that's left? Well, that goes to the question of what size army Ukraine would have. Was it 800,000, as some numbers have been floated? Is it 500,000? Is it more like a police force without the heavy weapons and capabilities continue the war? Those are the issues involved in the so-called security working group of the officers, Grinkevich on the U.S. side, Driscoll, that's his name, the Army Secretary on the U.S. side, and Kostyakov and Fomin, the two generals on the Russian side of the table. Now, if that's what I mean to answer your clarification question, do we go back to Greenland now, or should we stick to the...
I'm glad I took you down this tangent, because this is all very important. These are details that we really have to bear in mind as we consider what's happening here. But yeah, I would like to return to my overarching question. What do you understand the Russian government's position to be?
All right, so I hold up my fingers, and my fingers are three. So we've got a big swap of three. And this finger is the crucial Ukraine war territorial settlement, DMZ and security guarantees settlement, who would enforce security guarantees on the Ukrainian side to protect Ukraine from a further Russian attack, and who would protect Russia from a further Ukrainian US NATO attack. That's finger number one. Finger number two, Greenland. Your question was, what exactly has President Putin said about Greenland, and what has been the Russian reaction to what he said? Here's what he said the evening before Witkoff, Kushner, and Grunbaum showed up at the Kremlin. He was in a staged question and I'm looking at my notes of the Dances with Bears piece, so anyone who doubts what we're talking about, who wants to have a genuine argument about the evidence, go to the article. What happened was that on January 21, in a staged question and answer at the Security Council, that is staged because it's a confidential meeting, but this part was open, President Putin was asked about Greenland and about Gaza. About Greenland, here's what Putin said, quotes, "As for Greenland, what is happening around Greenland does not concern us in any way. Now that sounds like it means we are going to let the United States do whatever it wants and whatever the European allies agree, starting with Denmark or the Greenlanders, if they're to be involved, for the future of Greenland. That's what he said. Subsequently, the evidence is, and it's partly submerged, it's partly open, it's partly based on what my sources talked to me about. That was the interpretation is Putin is signaling, I'm standing back from the terms that you, Donald Trump, negotiate with Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, with the Scandinavian states, especially Denmark, and on the future of Greenland. And my understanding there, and the Russian understanding, is that something like the Cyprus deal is coming. Cyprus deal, for everybody, is the establishment of British territorial sovereignty at 2 military bases in Cyprus as the condition for the granting of independence, which the Cypriots won from the British in 1960. Those 2 bases are called Akrotiri and Dhekelia. You know more about this than I do, Dimitri. But let's just remind everybody that in Cyprus, since independence, the British have held on to 2 bases which are British territories. And if you ever want to go there on your tourism in Cyprus, go and have a look. They look like English cottage towns with green lawns and English trees and the whole panoply of English residential life. That's what they are. They're British.
Yes, and there's also British pubs packed with British soldiers, which I've had a beer myself, just for the purpose of observing. And I just want to pause there and say, so people understand what this actually means. During the genocide in Gaza, Britain has, it's well documented that Britain has used the Akrotiri military base to help perpetrate crimes against humanity in occupied Palestine. And every time the Cypriot president has been asked about this, he has used the fact that Britain has sovereignty, formally speaking, legally has sovereignty over the territory on which these bases are situated, to disavow any responsibility for the use of the island to carry out these crimes. So people need to understand, if they adopt the Cypriot model in Greenland and they interpret it the same way as the Cypriot government has interpreted it, it means that the Americans will have carte blanche to do whatever they want with those Greenland military bases.
And what that formula represents is that the Trump's demand that the U.S. owns the territory would be correct. Now the details of the Constitution of Greenland, in which there can't be foreign alienation, foreign ownership of the land underneath structures on Greenland, that may be resolved in a way that I don't yet know. But in any event, basically, what Putin was saying with "we stand back" was we can't influence the formula that you're going to use in Greenland. Mm-hmm. And that's the formula understood. What is arguably misunderstood about what President Putin said becomes clearer when we put Greenland in the context of the war at sea against Russia. And that's not something Russia is stepping away from. There is a war underway on all the seas of the world, and especially the major shipping and trade corridors, designed to destroy Russia's capability to run tankers carrying energy products, principally crude oil, but also petroleum products, gas, to export markets in the rest of the world. And there's no doubt that the US side believes as much as the Europeans and the British and NATO that Russia is vulnerable in the war at sea. Now, Greenland's role is for the United States to establish whatever military capabilities it wants, including the Golden Dome system of missile defense on the western edge or the western side of the Arctic routes, trade routes that Russia has developed, that Russia protects with a string of military bases along the northern Arctic coasts of Russia, heading towards the Bering Strait, Alaska, and Canada. Canada is subject to a Greenland type pressure game or protection game or extortion game or a standover game from the US side. Canada is being attacked explicitly by Trump. On the one hand, there's the 51st state annexation threat. The second, to peel off Alberta or other parts of Canada for US domination. And finally, there's the more recent Trump attacks or Trump administration attacks on the, quotes, failure of Canada to adequately prepare defenses in the Arctic around Ellesmere Island and the other Canadian islands that constitute the eastern end of the Arctic corridor. Now, is it the US strategy to combine a fortification of Greenland with a fortification of the Canadian Arctic islands to squeeze to death Russia's capability to move cargoes through what the Russians call the northern route, but we could call it the Arctic corridor, which constitutes a major expanding trade route with global warming, with the melt of the ice, with the improvement of the ice-breaking technologies and capabilities. This Arctic corridor represents a major alternative for Russia, China, India, and other countries in Asia to receive and trade goods as an alternative to the other trade routes that are longer and subject to more intense US or US combined with Middle Eastern pressure, such as the Strait of Hormuz, which links Iran and the Arab Peninsula to the Indian Ocean and oil trade with China and eastwards, or the Red Sea or the Suez Canal. What we're talking about here is as much pressure in the Arctic as the US has already applied to the Panama Canal, the major choke point between the Pacific and the Atlantic. So the President Putin was not saying what is happening around Greenland doesn't concern us when he means the Arctic corridor, the northern route. He does not mean we're stepping away from that. And that's been clarified in a couple of places since he made that remark. That is notwithstanding that the Greenland is the second part of the big swap. The third part we can come to in a minute is Gaza. But
okay, John, if I might just intervene there, I just want to clarify for our audience so they get oriented as to what we're talking about geographically here. I put up on the screen, a map of Greenland. You can see in the upper left-hand corner where the Thule U.S. Air Base is situated, and further in the upper left-hand corner, that's Ellesmere Island belonging to Canada, which you referred to. And I take it I think we can say, even though we're not military experts, that the location of that air base gives the United States considerable control over maritime traffic between Greenland and Ellesmere Island and down the western coast of Greenland as well. But I also understand, John, by the way, that, and this is based on some an interview that former retired U.S. Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson gave recently, that the U.S. in fact already has dozens of bases, military bases, dozens on Greenland, although all the attention is focused on this particular air base. I don't know where he gets that information. I'm not sure. I have confidence he knows a lot more about this subject than I do. I'm not sure, however, how reliable that is. What is your understanding, John, as to the extent of U.S. military bases on Greenland at this time? Are we talking about a military footprint that is goes far beyond the Thule Air Base? Is that your understanding as well,
yes, that's my understanding.
Right.
And you made the point that Dimitri, that there's a difference between the present status of U.S. forces on Greenland and their present relatively limited NATO coordinated role. And the autonomy that would be what we've just called the Cyprus model, the Akrotiri-Dehelia model, in which there would be U.S. sovereignty over a more comprehensive U.S.-based system for a more, let's call it offensive power projection, and in Russian terms or Chinese terms, because those are the two enemy states allegedly threatening not only Greenland, but in recent U.S. remarks, threatening Ellesmere Island and the Canadian Arctic. What's intended here is U.S. autonomous operational capability to escalate, to close that corridor. And that's part of a bigger, much bigger war at sea. And I need to remind everybody, and I'm just reaching around my table, which is covered in paper, that the Scandinavian states, the NATO states, including Britain, have just issued a major attempt to close the Baltic to Russian tanker trade. Now, I'm just looking down at my piece of paper here to draw everyone's attention to a relatively new statement published on 26th of January. That's 2 days ago, several days after President Putin commented on Greenland, and several days after the U.S. attack on, quotes, allegedly inadequate Canadian defenses in the Arctic around Ellesmere and others. Published on the 26th of January is a statement, let's call it a statement of intention. It's a declaration that they will close the Baltic Sea. We, the coastal states of the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, that's Belgium, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Sweden, and the United Kingdom with Iceland, are approaching the internet. I'm reading here, folks. International maritime community, especially flag and port states, with this letter. And then the letter goes into a scheme for enforcement against vessels if they don't meet these various rules which the Europeans propose to interpret to their advantage. It embodies a scheme of attack on the so-called Black Fleet, Phantom Fleet, Ghost Fleet, the Russian, that carries Russian oil, the sanctioned goods, to the rest of the world. It reflects an escalation of effort to stop and search, and therefore potentially seize or arrest Russian vessels that don't meet the new terms. Among the terms, I just can't, we've got less time to go through the details, but the letter says, in order to uphold and strengthen maritime safety in the Black Sea and North Sea region, we require, and that means we will use our force, our navies, our air force, to all vessels exercising freedom of information, navigation, strictly comply with applicable international law, whether customary international law is contracting parties to international conventions. Well, we all know what that really means in terms of the sanctions operations. It doesn't mean applicable international law. It means applicable sanctions diktats from the European side, from the UK, from NATO, and from the US. And then there are particulars. Vessels shall, that's imperative, shall sail under the flag of only one state, and vessels that sail under the flags of two or more states may be treated as a ship without nationality. That means without nationality, a vessel may be boarded and arrested and seized and its cargo confiscated, as happened with the Marinera, which the US seized off the coast of Scotland. That didn't have a cargo inside it. And the Grinch, I'm reaching to my right to pull up the piece of paper where the French naval forces seized the tanker known as Grinch. That doesn't relate exactly to General Grinkiewicz, the head of the European Command, but the name's similar. The Grinch was taken in international waters between the coasts of Spain and Algeria on the French allegation, starting with a suspicion and then an arrest, that it was flying under a false Comoros flag, and it was on sanctions lists of the US, the European Union, and others. So what have we got here? We've got a declaration of intention to escalate the war against Russian vessels moving in the Baltic and North Sea through the Danish Strait. That's what's happening there.
Okay, John, can I just pause for a moment? Because I don't want to forget about Gaza. I want to come back to Greenland and the maritime issues. Could you just tell us briefly what is the Russian, and we may need to focus upon this in another segment, but what is the Russian position with respect to the Gaza part of the proposed swap?
Well, the Gaza position has been announced in the readouts that Yuri Ushakov has given of the meetings, and by further statements by Kremlin spokesman Peskov, that the President Putin has indicated that he would join the BOP, the Board of Peace. That's the Trump organization of up to 50 invited states minus Canada, which has been disinvited, and would consider paying the equity fee. Remember, that's the $1 billion. It's not a membership of BOP. It's an equity fee. It's to join the development of or redevelopment of Gaza under Trump's control. President Putin has said two things about joining the BOP. First, in principle, the Russians agreed that to endorse the intention of the President of the United States to end the Israeli Hamas fighting over the territory of Gaza, and supports not only a ceasefire, but a settlement in which the Palestinians can survive, in principle. Second, that the Russian side would consider the Trump invitation, but has referred the details, that's the charter of the BOP and so forth, the terms and details in which the US would run this operation, the BOP operation, to the Foreign Ministry for study. Well, that's a way of saying we'll wait and see, because the chart is obvious and we don't need to go through it. Lots of very expert opinion and analysis has been given of the charter that makes it essentially a Trump and family a redevelopment operation enforced by the Israeli army. And it's coordinated with Israel. Let's leave that aside. what Putin is saying is we'll refer to the details to the foreign ministry as a way of saying we won't commit yet, but we will commit in principle. The third element is we will pay up the $1 billion equity fee, but it's going to come out of the $5, $6, $7, or $8 billion worth of Russian assets currently frozen in the United States and frozen by the United States as part of the Ukraine war sanction. Release the money, and we will promise to invest the money in your Gaza scheme. Those are the 3 points that Russia has will be acceptable in principle and in practice, but have not yet been decided on the Russian side. So the 3 parts of the big swap are essentially tentative and conditional. Each side of the swap is conditional on the Russian side because it doesn't trust President Trump to commit to any of the principles that are called the Anchorage formula. What does the Anchorage formula mean? It's short for the Russian, let's say, position that at Anchorage, Alaska last August, when Trump and Putin met, they were supposed to meet for 4 hours. They met for only 2. We've discussed it many times. Trump has a short attention span. Putin gave him a lecture on what Russia wants and why it wants it and the history of conflict. Trump couldn't stand listening any longer, said, I'm going home, canceled the working group lunch, canceled all of the arrangements, short of a 12-minute press conference, again dominated by President Putin giving an 8-minute lecture. What the formula is from the Russian side is, we believe Trump agreed to what we said were the principles of long-term security for Russia in the Ukraine and the broader problem of reducing the future war against Russia that the US, the NATO alliance, are pursuing, including what we've just been calling the sea war, the sanctions war. Okay? That's the formula. But go on.
Sorry, I just want to take us back to the Greenland issue for a moment.
Right.
So in your article, you use the word concession, and I thought about that before we began talking today, and I'm struggling a little bit with the use of that term because Greenland is not Russia's to give, and Russia has no treaty obligation to defend Greenland. In fact, sure, NATO is intensely hostile to Russia and is effectively prosecuting a war on Russia and has been for 4 years. And it seems to me that Russia, in a way, has a powerful incentive to stand back and let Trump do whatever, and not, first of all, I don't think Russia militarily has either the willingness or the capability to defend Greenland. But even if it did, it has an incentive to stand back and let Russia do whatever he wants, because this could ultimately lead to the collapse of NATO. If Trump is aggressive enough, it becomes impossible for European leaders to continue to justify to their populations Europe's continued involvement in NATO. If it won't even protect them from U.S. aggression. So I can easily imagine that people inside the Russian government are saying, do whatever you want with Greenland. The more aggressive you are, the better it is for us. But in any event, it's not Russia's to defend or to abandon. They have no responsibility in that regard. I think the only thing that Russia could give or would be inclined to give is some kind of formal acknowledgement that it recognizes U.S. sovereignty over Greenland. But how much value that actually would have to the United States government, especially with the U.S. having veto power at the UN Security Council, it would be able to veto any resolution that seeks to punish the United States for an aggression against Denmark and Greenland. So at the end of the day, John, I'm kind of struggling with why this would be properly categorized as a concession on Russia's part at all. I can totally understand why Russia would say, hey, man, you do whatever you want with Greenland. That's none of our business.
Everything you said is correct. And if I've suggested that the 3 way swap is a concession, I'd withdraw. It's not in the senses that you've just spelled out. I agree, and the Russian side are clear. They encourage any splitting between the United States, the Scandinavian states, and the rest of NATO. Any conflict within NATO or between NATO and the United States is, from a Russian point of view, exactly as you said, to the Russian side's advantage. What is also clear is the Russian side is seeking strategic nuclear arms reduction with the United States, and the Golden Dome represents an escalation in defiance of the terms of the START Treaty, the expiring New START Treaty, or the proposals for disarmament that the Russian side have offered the US for another year to negotiate. Any escalation using Greenland is something the Russian side have clearly said they oppose. So they're not standing back from that use or application of Greenland, nor is there any Russian standing back or concession on any attempts the US and the NATO side and the British and others apply to Russia's trade corridors or to Russia's movement of oil in defiance of illegal sanctions. There's no concession there. So by linking Greenland to Gaza, to the Ukraine, we're essentially talking about the potential for Russian concession on the territorial definition in the Ukraine. Yes, we're not talking about a Russian concession to whatever the US, NATO, and Denmark and the Greenlanders conclude should be the future for Greenland as an American fort.
Okay.
So that's the element.
So let's talk a little bit more about this extraordinarily important, and I think it is absolutely vital that you highlight, as you have, that there is a larger, almost global in scope war on Russia's maritime transportation. And it occurred to me, John, as I've been thinking about a lot of this last week, to me, this is that the issue is even bigger than that, because the United States, first of all, has, I think, by far, this is the one of the one or two respects in which the U.S. continues to have dominance, militarily speaking. It has a navy of global scope, and
yes.
and its navy can project power in any corner of the planet. And not even the Chinese Navy can match the U.S. Navy. In its own waters, in its own region, China is more than enough of a match for the U.S. Navy. But globally speaking, it doesn't have the ability to project power to the degree of the United States. And certainly Russia does not either. And in the background here is a lot of chatter amongst the military elite in the United States about imposing a naval blockade on China itself. And I just want to put up on the screen here an article published in November 2025 by the U.S. Naval Institute. And in it, they wrote, to win a war with China over Taiwan, the U.S. must adopt a three-tier strategy. It must hold, constrain, and advance. Initially, Taiwan must be empowered and supplied to hold off the Chinese attack, with none of the parsimonious hand-wringing that has characterized the response to Russian aggression in Ukraine. Oh my God. I'm going to refrain from commenting on that. It goes on, it says, it's far easier to defend than to dislodge, and blah, blah, blah. But the next paragraph is key. Next, the Navy must constrain China's ability to prosecute the war, cutting vulnerable sea lines of communication with an open blockade across the Indo-Pacific, while recognizing the threat China's proxies will present to interdiction. My sense, John, is that this is really the beginning of a broader war by the United States on the freedom of navigation of all of its geopolitical rivals, not just Russia. And I think Russia is kind of I guess you could say that maybe the West Asia was the beginning at which it began to test, in the Red Sea, the ability to impose by means of force its will on
Yes.
maritime transportation. Then they expanded it to the Caribbean with the blockade of Venezuela. Yes. Then, and in the background, you were having attacks on maritime shipping in Ukraine. Then they seized that tanker in the North Atlantic, which was flagged at the 11th hour by Russia.
Yes.
They recently, the United States recently reported that it blew up a vessel off of South America, the western coast of South America, in the Pacific waters, not in the Caribbean. Yes. And there's all this talk about, imposing a naval blockade on China. So I think that this power, which holds itself out as being the guarantor of freedom of navigation, has actually decided that the one respect in which it remains militarily dominant, namely the projection of military power, it's going to use that to effectively constrain maritime transportation by all of its geopolitical rivals. Is that where you see this heading, John?
Yes, indeed. And the one other rising regional power becoming superpower is India. And India is equally threatened by this new US doctrine of interception, projection of force to control sea lanes that link, for example, India and China to Iran. India, the Grinch, take the seizure of the Grinch, for example. I hope it's very difficult from a point of view of our audience without maps on the screen that we're to understand that we're jumping from one sea to another, one choke point, Strait of Hormuz, to the Danish Straits, to the Dardanelles and the Black Sea. We're jumping from one sea to another, from Caribbean Venezuela blockade to the approaching Iran blockade around Hormuz that's underway at the moment, to the attempt to take Greenland and Ellesmere Island, east and west of the Arctic corridor, to constrain Russia, China, and India. Those are the major superpower stakes. And yes, you're quite right. The US side is waging, with its naval projection, the capability to impose with its allies. So that's why I read out the January 26th statement from the European allies, the capability to attack an adversary, in this case Russia, in the Arctic, or in the Baltic, or in the North Sea, or India in the Indian Ocean, from the Red Sea, sea around Oman and the Persian Gulf to the Malacca Strait. That's India, where the US fighting platforms, Pakistan, for example. To the China Sea containment and constriction around China and Taiwan. These are all US operations that are not described in the so-called national security strategy of America first around the Americas. No, this is international warfare attacking everyone at sea. So I hope we're not confusing everybody by talking about too many seas all at once. That's number one. Number two, let me try to limit what I have to say to the seat on which I sit, which is Russia. Russia has now a new challenge, and this isn't being discussed yet, but it must be, and it's obvious. The Russian defense of its trade has so far been the so-called Black Fleet, about 1,500 tankers operating in defiance of US and European NATO illegal sanctions against Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China, with secondary sanctions against China and India. We've talked about it before. Okay, when we focus on the combination of allies at sea, what they're trying to do, exactly as you said, is to constrain and destroy each side's each of the, let's call it, allies in resistance, Russia, China, India, Iran, North Korea, and so forth, and eliminate the independence of states like India, Venezuela, to choose its trading partners. All of this is massive power projection at sea. Now, what's the Russian problem? Russian problem is 1,500 tankers aren't yet fully Russian flagged. The Marinera was the Bella 1. It had gone through several flag registrations, but as it fled the US attempts to attack it and board it and arrest it off the Venezuelan coast in the Caribbean, the Bella 1 headed for the Atlantic, made it into the Atlantic, and changed its flag registration, becoming a registered by the Ministry of Transport in Moscow to be Russian flagged. At that point, the Russian Foreign Ministry said to the State Department, and the two ministries of transport said, this is now a Russian flagged vessel we will protect. Go away. Desist from your attempts to seize or arrest this vessel. The US side decided to meet this challenge and preempt, and said, call out. And Trump actually spat in Putin's face on this issue. He said there was a Russian defense, there was a naval escort, a submarine under the water, and a corvette on the surface, which was shadowing the Marinero off the coast of Scotland, heading towards Iceland. But the Americans got there first with the British training, with British rehearsal from a British base in Scotland. They arrested the Marinera. What did Russia do then? Called it international piracy. And the Russian side said, we should hand over, the US side should hand over the 2 Russian crew members. In addition, there was some embarrassment when the spokesman for the Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, thanked the US, the pirate in chief, for agreeing to hand over the 2 of the crew. 2 Russians were then supposedly promised to hand over. The handover was actually delayed. Foreign Minister Lavrov complained about that, and over the last 24 hours or 12 hours, Maria Zakharova has announced that, yes, the Russians have been released and are on their way home. That's not the end of the Russian story here. Why? 2 reasons. One is that most of the crew were Indians, and they are being, Indian seafarers are being abandoned by the dark fleet, the phantom fleet, the alternative fleet. Let's just call it the alternative fleet owners. They are being abandoned to their fate, not paid, not fed. This is increasingly a problem in India. More than, and I think the number is more than 1,500 Indian seafarers are being abandoned by owners of this dark fleet as they are under attack for being associated with either Russian cargo or Russian ownership, all of which is kept secret because we're at war at sea over this sanctions war as part of the Ukraine war. Okay, now, because we have a situation where Indian seafarers are held hostage in this war, there's now a strong interest on the Indian side and the Russian side to combine to protect not only a vessel when it's Russian flagged, but a crew when it includes an ally like India, first. Second, if Russia is not going to reflag the tankers like it did with the Marinera and then use its naval and air force to protect, the US and the NATO allies will escalate and seize as many of the non-Russian flagged vessels as they can capture, leaving the Indian seafarers on board to their fates. So there is a significant double problem for Russia here. If it responds to what it's calling piracy or the war at sea against Russian cargo? Will it end the policy of, let's call it hidden flags, Comoros, Marshall Islands, you name the destination, Panama, Cyprus? There are as many flag destinations as there are countries wanting to accept fees for registering vessels. If the Russian side takes the policy of the US operation, the NATO operation, is to deny us our sea lanes, that's existential. Therefore, will we reflag the fleet? Therefore, will we defend our flag with all the force we can muster? That brings us to US-Russian naval and air and submarine conflict at sea everywhere. And so you rightly said, Dimitri, we are potentially at world war at sea. And India has a very important role to play because it's crewing these vessels. And because if Russia reflags the vessels, then India and Russia need to combine to protect not only the two masters or the officers on board these vessels, but the Indian crew, the Indian seafarers, represented by the International Maritime Union. So there's a combination of issues here which the Allies have yet to solve. There's a fundamental issue here for Russia to solve, which it hasn't yet decided, certainly not announced yet. If a vessel's to be flagged by Russia, re-registered like the Marinera, then what's the Russian Navy going to do?
So, John, I'd like to conclude our discussion by focusing on one relatively narrow aspect of this global war that the United States has embarked upon against freedom of navigation, and that is a potential naval blockade of Cuba. So it was widely reported yesterday in the Western press that Mexico's president had confirmed, or at least failed to deny, that her country had paused oil shipments to Cuba. And of course, in the background here is the fact that Cuba is clearly in the Trump regime's crosshairs. Cuba has become, because of these decades-long crushing sanctions, U.S. sanctions, illegal sanctions on the small island nation, Cuba has become critically dependent upon oil shipments from friendly Latin American governments. The Venezuelan supply has now been cut off,
Yes.
at least for the foreseeable future. So it would be, quite arguably would result in a humanitarian disaster if Cuba also lost access to Mexican oil. So this brings us to the question of Russia. And, Russia has longstanding ties to Cuba, probably not quite as close as they were during the era of the Soviet Union, but nonetheless, Cuba is now a partner state of the BRICS. And Russian President Vladimir Putin recently gave a speech in which he talked about the importance of Cuba-Russia relations. This was followed by a visit to Cuba by Russia's Interior Minister, Vladimir Kolokotsev. I may have mispronounced that, Kolokotsev. And he met in Havana with Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel. And following the meeting, the Interior Minister's spokesperson, Irina Volk, wrote on Telegram that, quote, the Russian minister expressed the opinion that despite the current turbulent geopolitical situation, ties between Russia and Cuba are becoming increasingly stronger and more reliable, close quote. She then said that the minister expressed his condolences over the deaths of Cuban military officers during the U.S. aggression on Venezuela, and that Russia's interior minister expressed the opinion that Cuba's accession to BRICS as a partner state in 2025 bolstered the, quote, coordination of our country's interactions in this multilateral format, close quote. Now, before asking my question, I also just want to note in passing, for what it's worth, that the Ukrainian media reported last year that over 1,000 Cuban soldiers are fighting on the side of Russia in the Ukraine war, and that at least 96 of them are either dead or missing. There could be zero truth to that. I don't know, but it is a sort of interesting tidbit of information. Nonetheless, my question to you is this, John. In the event that Cuba loses access to existentially important oil supplies from friendly Latin American countries, do you believe that Russia would be willing to fill the void and come to Cuba's rescue? Or do you think it's more likely, given the current circumstances, that Russia would be obliged to abandon Cuba?
It's a huge question. And it would be better if I just start off by saying, I don't know. And the question hangs very heavily over Russian decision makers. First principle, we've reached the end, and I hope our audience understands for all of our map talk, sea talk, that by focusing on escalation of sea war against Russia, China, and its India, Iran, and so forth, Venezuela, and now Cuba, what the US is doing is finding a way of squeezing to death a country by cutting off its oil, much as the Ukrainians would say, and the Russian general staff would say, we are cutting off electricity and water supply to Kiev to persuade the Ukraine to come to terms to end the war in the Ukraine. Squeezing to death by running a naval blockade enforced by US Navy requires a rethink on the part of the Russian side that running gauntlets with, let's call it the alt fleet, won't work in the future. They won't, running the gauntlet can only deter US action if there's a prospect of interstate warfare between navies. So to protect Cuba, it's not just a challenge to running the gauntlet and getting the oil in, much as the Berlin blockade was solved by US airlift, if you remember, over the Red Army's blockade of Berlin. Running the gauntlet can no longer deliver the oil cargoes on the part of the Russian side as exporter or on the part of a country that's an importer depending on that oil. It can't function. It won't work against a Trump expansion of his naval capacity. Will it work in deterrence terms if the Russian Navy and Air Force are engaged? That then raises a question that one hasn't heard from the so-called military experts in the podcast universe. Does the Russian Navy have the projection capability, the shore base support and logistics supply lines that are required to defend and deter, defend by deterring the United States from engaging at war at sea with tankers carrying cargo? Does the Russian Navy have that capacity? Is the Russian Security Council, the consensus-forming body that links President Putin to the intelligence services, the military services, and the Interior Ministry, as you've just described, does the Security Council have a view about reflagging and then defending the flag with force sufficient to deter the Americans, especially since we've got wars, and we've just explained them, you've done the explaining, on all the seas of the world all at once? Well, that decision hasn't been reached in Moscow yet. With respect to Cuba, a quick footnote. A couple of weeks ago, I did a Dances with Bears investigating the way in which some recently declassified documents from the George W. Bush archive revealed what President Putin had to say between 2001 and 2003. Those are the main documents. On a lot of topics, he and Bush discussed international terrorism, nuclear arms reduction, and mutual cooperation in trade, the restrictions on Russian exports to the United States, and that sort of thing. And if the audience want, they will find in this story what President Putin offered Bush on Cuba. That's why I'm mentioning it. What you saw back 25 years ago was the principle that President Putin had, that you could negotiate with the United States to offer something the US wanted on Cuba in return for what's something the Russian side wanted, which was the elimination of the Jackson-Vanik restriction on Russian ability to trade with the United States. That was what, and then increased trade liberalization between the two states. What the record shows, I'm not saying what my opinion is, what the record shows was that Putin would trade away the lured intelligence base on Cuba that was intended, whose military mission was to monitor all US signals within range of lured. And the Russian side did close down, as it offered, the lured electronic intelligence base as a concession to the US in return for concessions that Bush didn't deliver, as it turns out. And that story, 25 years old, is indicative of the way in which, and this goes back to your question, to what extent will Russia abandon one ally in order to achieve another form of national interest with its principal adversary, the United States or NATO? The 25-year-old lesson was that Putin would do that. What about now? Answer, and many of the critics of the piece I wrote say, Putin has learned his lessons from then. He's learned that you can't make concessions to the United States and expect to get any enforcement of the concessions you think you got, you think George W. Bush promised but didn't deliver, or you think that President Trump will promise in the so-called Anchorage formula, but won't deliver. Has President Putin learned the lesson of the lured base? Well, we know, for example, to be practical, and to get a little bit beyond my military competence, the lured base has been reopened, both by the Russian side and, importantly, by the Chinese side. There's considerable Chinese military investment in that station and expansion. And the US military publications have made an open source disclosure of considerable expansion. So on Cuba, there's now a major Chinese military investment. What will China do with Russia in contesting any attempt by the United States to squeeze to death Cuba? Well, that combination didn't exactly protect Venezuela from the US blockade and the attack that followed, that caused and led to the kidnapping of the President Maduro. Mm-hmm. We haven't time, we're running out of time, to discuss China's capability to project military power anywhere during the present military purge that President Xi is running in Beijing. Let's leave that aside, at least for another program, and at least for another expert than me. But what we've got is the challenge in your question. What will Russia do, alone or with its allies, to defend Cuba if the US decides to use its sea war capacity to destroy Cuba's resistance to the United States and inflict on Cuba the kind of settlement the US thinks it's inflicted on Venezuela, and it thinks it's capable of inflicting on Iran? First the smaller states, then the bigger ones. Russia understands perfectly well that the sea war is coming for Russia to inflict regime change inside Russia when the squeeze causes loss of economic growth, loss of prosperity, loss of confidence in the regime. We've seen the US trying both against Iran. We've seen the US trying both against Venezuela. We see, as your question points out correctly, Dimitri, it's coming for Cuba now, but it's also coming for China, it's also coming for Russia, and it's also coming for India. This is a war against all. And it's the leading edge is at sea. And sea, so far, is the, as it were, battlefield that Russia has not committed to fight, except on the Black Sea. Now, the Black Sea is obviously contiguous to Russian coast. And on the Black Sea, there's an ongoing war against British, American, NATO-supplied Ukrainian attacks on all sorts of Russian vessels. The counter is that Russia attacks Turkish vessels delivering military cargoes to Ukraine. We know that's going on, and it's direct there. Beyond the Black Sea, what's the Russian capability to defend? To defend its flag tanker off Scotland? No. And Trump has rubbed it in. On the Arctic route, that's to come. In the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, that's coming even closer, faster. In the Mediterranean, we don't know yet. We haven't seen a Russian flagged vessel intercepted the way the Grinch was, but we have seen Russian flag vessels. I've forgotten the name of it, but a Russian vessel carrying important cargo to North Korea was sunk off the Algerian coast by attack. It's now a year since that happened. So the capability of Russia to challenge, to defend Cuba, to come back to your question, has yet to be tested. The strategy issue has yet to be formulated in policy in Moscow openly. And we are at a point in which we go back to our big swap where we began. What concessions, or if we don't want to use the word concession, and you rightly pointed out where we shouldn't, what exchange of cards, what exchange of deals, what exchange of benefits and costs is the Russian side prepared to make without damaging its credibility to its allies, BRICS as a general group, China and India, North Korea and Iran specifically, and Cuba now, as Venezuela was a few weeks back. What capability is the Russian side prepared to hazard in a contest at sea in which it may regard itself as at a military disadvantage? All the military bloggers, especially the US ones, who emphasize Russian superiority in the Ukraine, have yet to weigh in on what's the Russian capability at sea far from the Russian coast.
Right. Well, John, fascinating discussion and deeply disturbing as well. I think this spells very, very serious trouble for the system of international trade that underpins the global economy today. In any case, we'll have a lot more to discuss in the days ahead, and I thank you again for joining us on Reason to Resist.
Thanks for having me, Dimitri. Good luck to where you are. Good luck to us all. Regime change by war at sea, that's what we've got now.
Absolutely, and hopefully I'll be able to report to you on that subject from Venezuela in the days ahead. Take care, John.